Thank you for joining us for this week's podcast. On this episode, we discuss what it means that we believe God is the creator of heaven and earth and why that should matter to us. So the rest of that line, the opening line, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, which is a very significant point. Well, all the lines in the Apostles' Creed are significant, right? It's not like any are lesser or greater. But there's a few points about creator of heaven and earth that are definitely important to examine and look at and sort of, expand upon. And, in no particular order, really, I guess we should just dive right into it. One of the first things that popped into my mind in thinking of God as creator is that in looking at creation, just how diverse it is, that there's just so much creativity with it. I know it's maybe redundant using just different forms of the word create, but like it's true. And I think I heard this, it might have been C.S. Lewis in one of his arguments. It might not have been though, but someone a while back, and you might know this, just sort of wondered, why is it that everything is as beautiful as it is, like with all the colors and the way like plants just function and the way animals function and just the diversity there. Why isn't, you could achieve a fine enough level of functionality with everything just being gray blobs. It's like, why did God create in such a way that nature is as awesome and incredible as it is? Like to the point where like just going on a hike is can be like a world changing event, just because of how amazing. I mean, you live by Denver and you see these, incredible mountain majesties every day, which I'm totally jealous of.
This is true.
Yeah, the best I get are some nice hills, some good looking trees. But so yeah, I mean that is something certainly that kind of shows the mind of God, of just how creative He is and how beautiful He is. And you mentioned a story last time. I think it was about your dogs.
Yeah, it did.
Sort of touching on that.
No, I'm with you. Like, I think this is really powerful. And I know we're getting really like into one word here, creator, but it is a root to the word creative. God's character of who he is just outpoured out, right, in creation. And so like the majesty and the beauty and the complexity, but also like just the elegance, if that makes sense. Elegant complexity. That's a David Foster Wallace quote. Been reading too much.
That's fun.
It pours out in the nature. So I was telling Ben last week after we did the pod that I get really into nature docs, especially about dog breeds, specifically my dog breeds. I don't think I have like super of a unique dog breed. It's not like one of the most popular dogs. I have a greyhound, and I have another whippet, which is basically a 35-pound greyhound.
Yeah.
And I was
I don't know how you could have a greyhound indoors. That just blows my mind.
So, quick side note, just because I love talking about dogs. This is unrelated to the pod, so here's a little bonus tidbit, not Apostles' Creed related, listeners. Greyhounds they call them like 70-pound couch potatoes. They're the world's fastest couch potatoes.
Really?
Yeah, my greyhounds and whippets, and even Italians, the little ones, if you give them 20 minutes of just dead sprint, just a day, they will literally sleep all day, and they'll be very happy doing it. Someone once called my dog a Lamborghini, in the sense that like when it goes out, it goes fast, and it goes really, really fast. Like a greyhound at its peak, like the racers can get up 45 miles an hour. My dog definitely can't go 45 miles an hour. But he can book it. He's faster than it when he really wants to get moving. Like when we play fetch out in the open space, like if there's another dog around there, it's not happening for them. It's not going to happen that day. They're not getting the ball.
Oh, wow.
But I say all that to say, like, I really like them because I think they're really unique creatures and they're really great. They have something called a double suspension gait, which is a really nerdy scientific way of saying how they run. Like these things were designed over like thousands of years and then kind of like peaked in like England. I mean, this breed's been around since like the actual Egyptian times. Like you can see them in hieroglyphics. So it's a very old breed. Like it's something that's been really, it just works for nature, right? But like they have this type of gait where at 2 points in their run, their feet are off the ground. So basically they're like a spring coil, right? Both ways. So like think of like two metronomes going like this, right? Or like
so
upside
waving
down.
in and out.
Yeah. So like upside down like this. So like their feet will be bunched in like a V shape where like the back paws are pointed forward and the front
Mhm.
paws are pointed backward, and that's their spring load position. And they hit the ground, their back paws hit the ground first, and that's where all the power comes from. They just like fly out, and while they're doing
Mhm.
that, their front paws are doing like a little tap tap just to add a little acceleration, and they kind
Mhm.
of like stretch out like doing the Superman thing, like in their
Mhm.
next thing. And then when they land, their front paws hit first and like tap tap, and then their back paws load up and give them a little push, and then they jump up again. It's amazing. Just watch it on YouTube sometime. It's pretty crazy.
Huh.
But then beyond that, because they're moving so fast, the greyhound's eyes are set wider and they have like almost like not dog like eyebrows. It's because their eyes are set out so they can have 270 degrees of vision because they're moving
Wow.
so fast and they're designed to catch prey, like small prey, like because they start in the desert, right? So like it's not like
Mhm.
things are like abundant. you know, you got to be able to see if something gets
Yeah.
away from you, gets in the sand, or gets over a hill and you can't catch it, like how to turn and pivot and book it really fast
Mhm.
there. So like it's just a really really cool thing, and I really get into that because like I mean think about that, like this is a house pet now, but like this is also something that's designed in like this amazing way to be a speed demon, and it's a dog, right? Like it's just a common household dog, like I told you, he's a couch potato. He sleeps all day. His name's Jasper. But like
Yeah.
Jasper was built and designed like in a theological sense by God, and then if in a more broad like evolutionary sense, like made to be and bred to be this like essentially like perfect type of hunter for his species. And so he's different and he's unique, and I just find real artistry in that. Like he literally is sleek and long and thin, and he's skinny, and people think that's ugly, but it's because they're aerodynamic. They don't they weren't they needed to have that low body fat so they could
Mhm.
move. Unlike a lab who's swimming and retrieving things, like they need to go all terrain. Like greyhound's not like that. They're just like, hey, let me loose. So they're a really cool breed. Get a greyhound, rescue one from the track. But they exemplify to me the artistry of a dog and like of something simple. And then we can talk
Mhm.
about a million other types of animals, like I don't know,
Like a
ants.
beaver.
Yeah, no, seriously though, like a beaver.
Like
Like think about
beavers are crazy.
yes, the functionality of their teeth and like the padded like tail and like how like it's really truly like when you sit there and think about it, like the complexity of this, like oh, it's an animal, like what is that? But this is God's creative outpouring and an insight into His mind, right? Like
Mhm.
just think about the amount of time that you'd have to like spend as a human to create something that creative. And we read a lot of creative books, but a lot of it's just based on reality because the
Mhm.
reality that we live in, the physical world that we live in, is so beautiful. And I think that's what's so compelling about it and about this section, or at least when we start thinking about God as creator and the value of this part of the creed, is that it's kind of setting us up, I think in a good way, to appreciate what God has laid out before us. I
Yeah.
don't know, I ranted Ben about my dog.
No, it's fine. I have nothing against that. And yeah, we could go on for forever about that just because there's so much complexity and just awesomeness. If I can use that word without, I don't want to keep repeating the same words. Just in creation, just in the world. But that also
But we
sort of
run out
leads
of words.
into what?
Yeah, we run out of words for it though, because it's almost defies words. It's beautiful. It's art.
Hmm. Yeah, very true. But that kind of leads into the next point, um, which is really just like examination of the natural world. It's like
Yeah.
we have, the sciences, we have the scientific method, like we can, conduct experiments with nature. We can, set up hypotheses, we can test them, and we can achieve, consistent results. But that really only works within a structured system
Yeah.
that like is reasonable. Like it wouldn't make any sense to try to conduct an experiment and try to see what the boiling temperature of just uh, I don't know, just pure H2O is, just like pure water. Try to figure out what the boiling temperature is if every time it's going to be different
Yeah.
because it's not a consistent system. And I don't know how often we actually think about that, and maybe we take it for granted that the universe is very consistent. Like that's why we have natural laws, which is
Yeah.
really just consistent observations. Like we have the law of gravity, which is consistent. Like it's not like someday you're going to go out there, throw a rock, and it's going to float. Uh, like these are consistent across the entire universe, which also is reflective of who God is, in that God is very logical. And I appreciated that quote that Jordan, you said earlier when we were doing prep. If you want to repeat it, it's a short quote,
Yeah.
but I really like it.
So shout out to Dr. Quanstrom at Olivet Nazarene University. He once said to me in class, well, not just me, but a couple other people. We
Mhm.
were doing like a like debate session thing. We were presenting a paper, and I was doing something about natural law, and then he kind of ends up with my summary, and he goes, so basically, and he goes, this is how I interpret it, and he's like, this is what I think. He goes, logic is the language of God. So like when he speaks things into existence and he communicates these things, like the language of the universe, like the structure of the universe is that logic. And by logic, what he meant was like the order, which is
Mhm.
kind of what you're saying. Well, actually, it's exactly what you're saying. We wrote this to we talked about this together. So, but it's the order in which he created things, like our ecosystems and the complexity of those, like the weather patterns and like how it can be sustainable over time, or exactly what you said, like the boiling point of water. The world is structured in a way that it works and it functions not only for us to use, but for other animals and other creatures to live. It's ordered and it's not chaotic, and like you'll see a lot of that language in the Old Testament too. I don't know if you think that's fair, Ben, but the Eastern
Mhm.
Church uses that language a lot. They talk about the order of the world and like how God is a ruler and orders it in that beautiful way. And they don't talk about order like we talk about order in the West, where it's like, oh, I'm being bossed around. We like to talk about like artistic freedom and stuff. Like that's more
Yeah.
Western.
Mhm.
But for them, like the order is the beauty, right? Like
Yeah.
the order is that God is in control and that he structured the world in a way that it speaks to his existence. It is his words, right? When
Mhm.
he says, let there be light, there's light. And that's a solar system plus the universe.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Um, yeah, and that's another one. I mean, all these we could just go on for forever about. But just sort of, to branch off of that, I'm sure you're also, because we've had conversations about this. How unfortunately there tends to be a lot of tension between science and Christianity. I mean, just as much within Christian circles as in, scientific, material. What's the term? Uh, Materialistic reductionism, I
yeah,
guess. Sort of the view that everything can be reduced to just biological components.
yeah,
Anyways, just sort of, but it's really just a false conflict. Like there really isn't any conflict between Christianity and science, because science is simply the observation of the universe and discovering how it functions,
yeah,
why it functions the way that it does, and which just supports the Christian view that, well, of course it all makes sense. Like that's only logical. Of course,
yeah,
like God is logical.
yeah,
I mean, it'll so I don't totally get why there is a tension there, and I sort of have to shake my head every time that comes up, and it's just sort of sad because I feel like it's just a waste of time because it doesn't make any sense to me.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, and you can tell me if this is an appropriate place to do this. We could do another pod in this in full, but like, I agree with you. I think you really were clear on your terms. I think science properly understood is just what you said. It's observing the
mhm,
rules and patterns of nature in a testable way that we know is reliable and consistent. And that's
yeah.
kind of how we determine it as quote unquote true, right? Like
Mhm.
if the boiling point of water, like you said, was 98 point, I don't know, what is the boiling point of water? This is really bad.
Uh,
I went to it in public school.
yeah, I
Don't
don't
judge
know.
me. Let's
Well, we'll
pretend
go
we
on
know.
Celsius because Celsius is based on water. 100 degrees Celsius is the
There we
boiling
go.
point of water.
Ben just bailed me out big time, guys. You don't even know. So 100 degrees Celsius, and that's the boiling point of water, right? Well, we know that because we've boiled water hundreds and thousands and millions of times forever and ever and ever. And we know it's like we can almost say it and we treat it as fact. But theoretically, like if something were to change in nature, which is highly, highly, if not impossible, unlikely, if not impossible, it could be 101 or
Mhm.
99.5. It theoretically could happen. And yes, if you're a science major listening to this, it could be with different conditions and pressure. There's some variation. Yes. I'm not good enough at science to to do this, but the point is simply this, that it's consistent laws over time, and science properly understood evaluates that and explains that and expresses that in a way. And I think the problem comes when Christians in science or scientists, I suppose, the people that really like make the decisions, like
Mm-hmm.
the movers and shakers of the world, want to
Yeah.
have what I like to call a totalitarian approach to truth.
Hmm.
And I think it becomes like, and this is something that I think Christians need to really like think about, and same with the scientists as well. Both types of blind faith in their own system is equally arrogant, you know,
Mm-hmm.
instead of trying to figure out a way they can communicate and work together. What I mean by that is simply this: that like when science says this is the facts and this is how the world is, and there's no evidence for anything outside of this, yes and no. Well, yes, but also like, what about the things you haven't discovered? Can we not, like, we have to affirm that they exist somehow? Like,
Yeah.
science is a relatively new thing in the past couple thousand years, or I don't even think
Mm-hmm.
it's thousands. I think it's like actually a couple hundreds,
Yeah, I
right?
think just a few hundred in terms of like the scientific disciplines.
Yeah,
Yeah, because they
exactly.
they really didn't start becoming popular until like the turn of the 20th century, I think,
Exactly.
like
There's a really good,
1800s. Yeah.
yeah, there's a good book I read in college called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Words are hard.
Uh-huh.
Uh, it wasn't about, it's actually about postmodernism, not this debate, but it brings up a really good point about science. It talks about like when these big scientific discoveries were happening. This guy from MIT writes it, Thomas Kuhn, brilliant man, and he writes this like basically this little diatribe about the Niels Bohr atom or model of the atom, where we kind of had the
Mm-hmm.
plum pudding model, and then we kind of like move forward to our modern atomic ones. In between, like all these little sub things you're taught in science class, like all the like you know electrons and or
Protons and neutrons and
yeah, but well, the neutrons were discovered later, right? We didn't even know about those
wow.
until the other experiment. But like early on, it was like you know, protons and neutrons were just inside this little circle, is how they illustrated it.
Hmm.
And then eventually, we've gotten to the point where we see that the electrons are on the outside, not because of experimentation, but like when we first did the experiment that showed that there was more centered mass, right, inside the atom, and that's where the bulk of it came.
Hmm.
And then before we discovered charge and discovered the mass and the charge and kind of came up with neutrons, as far as I understand it, science major is going to be like shaking his head right now, whoever that person is. Um, like, why did we jump to that from one model to the other rather than coming up with alternative theories? Because, like, remember, when scientific discovery happens, when they ran those experiments, what they do is they find a gap in the current system, and then they
Hmm.
have to create a new system to understand it.
Hmm.
So the whole idea is this: that like, why does one decision get made over the other? And his point is a political point. Like, it's the politics of science of the day, and like how well
Ah.
one is marketed and all that. And like I said, it's about postmodernism and truth. But the
Yeah.
point remains that he's basically poking a hole in science and saying, hey, listen, this is what I made my career on, but also like we're not infallible. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And like
Yeah.
sometimes like we learn new things, so like we should keep doing it, but
Hmm.
we also can't act like we have a totalitarian hold on truth. On the other side, and this is wherever you fall on the spectrum as a listener. I'm assuming you're a Christian or you're debating in the faith. You can, if you'd like, determine the biblical text as fully literal in the sense that it is a historical book, and there's going to be some hoops that you're going to have to jump through and overcome. Just to be honest with you, some things that just aren't going to match up with what we know
Yeah.
historically, and you can wrestle with that however you like. You
Yeah.
know,
Check out Ken Ham if you really want to land on that part of the spectrum.
fair enough, and that's fine. Like, I'm not telling you that that's wrong. I think there's room in Christianity for the this type of view. We'll call it the fundamental view. Not accusing
Hmm.
you of being a fundamentalist, but it is a fundamental view, right?
Yeah.
Versus more of like a progressive view, which would be like, I don't know, that theistic evolution, or what is it? What is the word?
Uh, Intelligent design.
That's the word I was trying to say.
That one.
Words.
Okay. Which is so I don't know how I pulled that one out.
Yeah, that was awesome. But like the idea that like, oh wow, no, God worked in nature and things and species evolve all the time, is that argument I laid out last pod, right? Of like God
Hmm.
picking the best possible world. Like you could think that way. And that's kind of where I tend to land. I'll just be honest with you about that. But like, I have a lot of really good friends that are actually honest to God fundamentalists, right? Like just
Yeah.
6 days and that was it, period.
Hmm.
You know?
Right.
And that's fine. Like, again, like that's totally fine. Like there's room for that. But I think the problem comes when it becomes an arrogant thing of like
Hmm.
your worldview is so tight, airtight, that you've even let go of your own social structures and like your own social awareness to like do anything other than debate it and make it true. And that happens on both sides of the aisle. Do not let, like, I think a lot of times, especially like, and this is not supposed to be an accusation, like
Hmm.
schools, colleges tend to do this. Like they make it really
Yeah.
seem like it's on one side there, and it's
Hmm.
not. It's absolutely not. Both types of blind fanaticism are arrogance, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think the terms that I've heard is sort of the tension between fundamentalism and scientism, which I think scientism is sort of what you're touching
Yeah.
on, where
Yeah.
it's this sort of it's a very new idea where science is actually a way to structure a new morality. Like science can actually give us all the answers, type deal, where it's like that's not science isn't made for that.
Yeah.
But it also creates a lot of tension, which I think is why nowadays there still seems to be tension between science and Christianity, because scientism tends to be a very loud voice
And
of
same
like,
with
oh, we don't need
fundamentals.
religious structures. Science can give us everything we need to know for living morally and ethically and all that.
Exactly.
But that's sort of a side note. But just
Yeah.
yeah, just to bring another word in there to maybe categorize,
Yeah, I know.
be very modern about it.
Yeah, there we go. We'll be good. We
Yeah.
can. I don't have any good books offhand on this. There's a lot of really good stuff about intelligent design written by William
Hmm.
Lane Craig. So if you're really interested in that and you want to kind of dive deep into this debate, reasonablefaith.org is a really good website. It's William Lane Craig's website, Biola University, Talbot School of Theology is where he works. Um, Him and his group of people, they write articles, they discuss this. So you'll have his books out there, podcasts. Listen to ours too, and then listen to his after. But
Because you're not going to want to listen to us after you listen to him.
shameless plug. Make sure you start with us instead of him because we're beginning, we're starting, and it's more me than Ben. Ben's fine. Anyway,
No.
really good resources to have a great discussion and to really think about it if that's something that you're being challenged with. I had a cousin that is she's actually an astrophysicist. That's what she does for a living.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, she went to a
Wow.
state school, and there's nothing wrong with going to state school. I sometimes I wish I had gone to a state school to get a different experience. To be really honest with you,
Yeah.
and it was really hard for her. She took a history class, and they were brutal. They like really beat up the Christian faith, and they brought
Hmm.
up the science arguments. Then she's in a science class taking like high end physics, and sometimes they just kind of took hits. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes they're attacking straw men, and I don't
Hmm.
think it's their fault. I think it's the loudest voices are usually the ones that are most extreme, and that's really frustrating.
Yeah. Which I mean, Richard Dawkins tends to be like the sort of the flagship uh, name in a lot of those
Yes.
movements, and he is horrible with straw men. Like I love how someone summarized it in a book. The book was titled "The Old Testament is Dying," just sort of a reflection on how in the Christian church a lot of people are very illiterate in the Old Testament. Anyways, one of the examples he gave was actually a lot of the attacks on Scripture are, even though they're from atheistic perspectives, are based on fundamentalist uh, I don't know, yeah, fundamentalist understandings
Yeah.
of scripture,
Yeah.
which is just another way of saying no offense to fundamentalists, but it tends to end up being very straw man arguments. So just like what you're saying, yeah, like I don't blame people either for saying that because those tend to be the way these things are discussed, which is very ignorant, I guess.
Yeah.
It's just almost like why even bother arguing with stuff like that when it's just based on very false interpretations of what scripture says. But
Yeah. So,
yeah,
but
that's
anyway,
a bit of a tangent.
no, we kind of. But I think it's relevant. Like we talk about God as logical, and we've kind of laid
Oh
out
yeah.
what intelligent design and talked about science. So I think there's an overlap there. So really, I think what we're trying to get at this point, when we're talking about God as creator and God as logical, is that as He
Mm,
creates the universe, He creates it with a structure, and there's an intention to it. We can understand it and appreciate it through science, as well as
yeah.
through the artistry and majesty of creation.
Hmm. Yeah. And this actually came up in one of my classes or one of my studies when I was a pastor, and we were talking about um, Genesis. We were working through Genesis, and right at the beginning, I was going over Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation narratives there. And I'm like you. I'm not going to say who's right and who's wrong. Like I don't have a problem changing my theology midair. But yeah, but I was just laying out some of the views that are not commonly held in churches, and I told my people this. I says I'm not saying believe this. I'm just saying these are different ideas. Maybe they'll help us appreciate the diversity of interpretation and some other ideas that might be present in the text. And one of the things I pointed out was that in Genesis 1 and 2, the order of creation actually conflicts. They conflict with each other.
They do.
Um, yeah, And someone in the church was very much against that idea, and it was actually this. No offense at all to this person, they just caught me so much off guard. I tried not to laugh uh, because it was just like wow, like they are very much like this is literal. This is a historical scientific account. Like we have to follow it. Like there's no real room for like analogical interpretation or anything like that. Um, it was just very interesting, but also hammered home to me the stance that I have, which I think is the same as yours, which is that uh, take what you want from Genesis 1 and 2. The point overall, and the point that the church has always taught, and the reason why in the creed, all it says is that God is the creator of heaven and earth, and it doesn't say anything else really about that, is that the point is not on how God created. Like, that's never been the point in any of this conversation. Um, like, there's some specific things, and we'll touch on those in a minute, but the real importance is just that God created. So I mean, wherever you land on this, if you disagree with Jordan and I and maybe how we interpret that, I'm not going to go into depth on my interpretation. But I just sort of gave up arguing about that because I'm like, look, if you want to view that God created in 6 literal 24-hour days, fine. If you want to see it as 6,000 years, fine. If you think the scientific account is an accurate understanding of how God did it, fine. I mean, to me, that's not the point. The point is that God created it, and which is really the critical component here in Christian belief.
Yep. Yes, that's great, and that this is part of his world. So, I think that's a great segue about the next thing is that there's
Yeah.
not really a definite way on how he created, but it's just that he created, and that importantly, what they're trying to stress is that the physical world matters,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we talked last pod about Gnosticism and like why the creed was established was because they're like, hey, we got to get this on paper, we got to get this out there, but before people get swept away in this myth of people trying to use our language against us to teach something totally wrong. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that they were teaching was that the physical world didn't matter because you're this disembodied spirit inside this fleshy thing that's bad. And so remember how we kind of talked about, if I can just refresh your memory real quick, that the physical world was going to fade away and we were all going to join into that one, right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've heard this in Sunday school or church at some point. And I'm not to say that that person was wrong or any less faithful or obedient to the will of Jesus Christ or is any less of a Christian for thinking those things. I'm simply saying that technically that's not really how the early church viewed it, and that's really
Mm-hmm.
not all that biblical, or at least not properly understood. It's using bad language to explain something. So
Yeah.
let's try to clear this up. Creation matters. It really matters. There was not a separate God, evil God, that created the planet Earth. God doesn't create Earth and just be like, yeah, I'm just going to blow this up later, and you're going to come join me in heaven. Like this this sound we just talked about God being logical. My question to you is this: what's the point then? Like why? Like what kind of grand experiment is this? And I had this argument in college with a little guy, and a guy looks me in the eye and he says to me, he's a pastor and he's a wonderful human being, really loves people, and is I know I will see him in the resurrected kingdom someday. I love this guy to death, but he says this to me, and I'm still this day rattled by it. He goes, "If God is a painter and Earth is art, the painter can do whatever he wants to the painting. It is totally his choice." And I was like, "Thank you for explaining to me the analogy. I'm still not getting the point. Like, why? Like with a painting, brush strokes are intentional. So if your whole point was to torch the painting, why paint it? You know what I mean?"
Yeah. It's sort of like playing with Legos, at least for me. Like growing up, I always would spend so much time building something, and then after a while, I would just dismantle it. It's kind of like that. Like, so what was the point?
Yeah, exactly. And so like and Legos are a toy, it's like endless amount of fun. So either
Yeah.
then we have to rework our theology and think of God as like wanting to play games, which doesn't really seem
Yeah.
consistent with the way
It's
we've known
a
him.
very imperfect analogy that I use. So I'm glad you're actually clarifying. Yeah.
Yeah. No, no,
Sorry.
you're good though. But like, it's the same point. No, it's the same point, and I think it's real, man. Like, and I think a lot we have to wrestle with this because like this is how we understand who God is. Like the person that we're trying to like follow and believe in and understand, like know about this person, right? It's what we talked about
Hmm.
last week. Like sit at the table and have a conversation. He's done this by giving us a biblical text to show who he is. That's his coffee table. Sit down and have a cup with him.
Yeah.
Um, sorry, that got on the side tangent, but my point is this, man,
It's
that
okay.
like the planet Earth matters, And unless God is like playing some kind of game, which is not consistent with what he said, we are basically left to one of these two options. Either it's wrong or his ways are higher. And both of those things I think are true to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one might be a little bit more real and true. And I think that's what the creed's telling us, that maybe there's a point to this. Like, this is important. Like, if he loves you and he created you and he gave you the body that you have, like, that's a real thing. Take care of it.
Yeah.
Like, you're gonna use it. We're gonna talk about resurrection later. Spoilers, but we're gonna talk about resurrection later, and it's a big deal. It's a big deal for the church for a really long time.
Yeah, which also touches on something we talked about last time, where you went on sort of better understanding Paul's use of the word flesh,
Yeah,
which very unfortunately, thankfully, I haven't heard it much in the last decade or so. But growing up, I heard it a lot
all the
used
time.
in terms of like literal, like my physical body, like my
That's such a
organs,
'90s thing.
chemicals and all that. Yeah, is that sort of like that is a bad thing that works against our spiritual nature,
Yeah,
which is exactly what Gnosticism taught,
yeah,
uh, which is heretical,
yeah.
and
Exactly.
it's just harmful. I mean, like even psychologically, it's just very damaging. And I've known people who are like that, who like hate their physical bodies because they think that it's evil or limiting them in some way. Like, well, God can't use me because I'm trapped in this physical body. Like, how is that a healthy outlook on like uh, like who you are as a person? And I guess, yeah, I will just sort of touch on this. I made a note here. I am not planning at all
I
on
was wondering if you were
really
going to.
diving into this because we totally could. But I just wrote in the example of the understanding of human sexuality nowadays is so off the charts. Uh, um,
Yeah,
I guess out there. But the sort of the main thread that underlies all of it that I hear constantly in these conversations is that my physical body doesn't tell me who I am. Like the biological function of my organs does not communicate to me my true identity. Like my true identity is my immaterial self, like my thoughts and my feelings. Like that's who I really am, and my body is just a vehicle for that. Which again is just building off this Gnostic view that my body is somehow lesser than my non-physical existence, which
yeah,
is not at all like what you're saying. It's never been the teaching of the church.
yeah,
And at the end of the day, like that's actually a very harmful thing. Like you have, I mean, major psychological issues that people face. And again, I don't want to go down this trail too much, but I
yeah.
mean,
We
it's
don't
something
want.
that we see all the time. But we have, as a culture, so bought into that idea that it's almost like we can't, like we're afraid to acknowledge it. Like it's somehow wrong to acknowledge that no, like your physical body actually matters.
Yeah,
Like this is a significant part of you. Like
yeah,
why do you hate who you are physically? I'm not talking like the body positivity movement. I just mean the fact that you have a physical existence.
yeah.
Why would you attack that part of who you are?
Yeah.
So
Yes, that's that. I'm glad that you touched on it instead of me, because I could not have said that anywhere near as articulate as you. And I just want to
nice.
tag one thing on. This is my footnote to Ben's epic rant, or epic just statement there. I don't think either of us are trying to discredit any kind of gender dysphoria, but what we're really
Right.
trying to illustrate is the non-biblical view that there are two different realities at work here: the internal spiritual reality and the external physical reality. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like that. I think a lot of times this language comes up when we talk about like purity culture. This is not a knock on purity culture, but like when we talk about like lust and things, especially in Paul's verses in Romans, and some of those passages, right? Like wrestling with the flesh. He's not talking about physically wrestling with my flesh. Yes, like physical urges, he's talking about that. What he's talking about is a healthy understanding of the world and order as it should be. And he's wrestling against his own sinful nature and his desire to like rebel against the will of God. When we talk about the fall of Adam, which we might get to eventually, like it really becomes a point of pride where like, no, I will not bow my will down to you. And
Mm-hmm.
so when God comes out with an edict that is designed to be helpful and beneficial and to protect you, right? Then when you say no, I can't do that, I won't do that, that is sin, right? Like that's the idea that we're talking about here. Does that
Yeah.
make sense, Ben? Is that what you're articulating, or am I adding too much on there?
No, that's yeah, you hit it. Hit the nail on the head.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it encouraging and edifying. If you want to connect with us, find us on Facebook or check out emdcampusministry.org to support the ministry. Thanks very much, guys.